an Abu Dhabi-based company with strong links to UAE authorities has apparently hired hundreds of Colombian military contractors before they were deployed to Sudan to support the RSF. One of the Colombian contractors with whom I spoke said that when he arrived in Abu Dhabi, he did not go through the regular passport control. He was sort of removed clandestinely, from the airport through the back, picked up immediately by a van and taken to a military site. That's where he told me that he received military training by Emirati nationals before he was then, after 10 days, sent to Chad very briefly and then on to Sudan, to Niala.
Sudan has been ravaged by more than 3 years of a brutal civil war, pitting the Sudanese Armed Forces against the paramilitary Rapid Support Forces. This conflict has created the world's largest and most acute displacement and humanitarian crisis. More than 14 million have been forcibly displaced. That's a quarter of Sudan's total population. Rights groups have accused both sides of the conflict of committing atrocities, mass killings, executions, and widespread sexual violence against civilians fleeing the fighting. And the role of the United Arab Emirates in providing military and financial support to the RSF has been widely documented and reported on. But the UAE has categorically rejected and refused these accusations. Now, a new report by Human Rights Watch reveals just how far the UAE is willing to go to protect and further its own interests in Sudan. The report documents how the UAE recruited and trained Colombian mercenaries, some of whom were former members of the Colombian army, to support, train, and fight alongside the RSF in Sudan. And here to talk to us about this new research is Joey Shea, senior researcher covering Saudi Arabia and the UAE at Human Rights Watch. Can you first just briefly talk us through your report, your main findings and conclusions?
Absolutely. So this report, which we've now been working on for over a year, documents, as you said, how an Abu Dhabi-based company with strong links to UAE authorities has apparently hired hundreds of Colombian military contractors before they were deployed to Sudan to support the RSF. Most significantly, we found that these Colombian contractors transited through sensitive UAE military and government facilities before they were deployed to Sudan to support the RSF. We also found linkages between the Colombian contractors and grave abuses on the ground. So one contractor who I spoke to told me that he helped to support the RSF's training of child soldiers, boys as young as 13, 14 years old. We also documented Colombian contractors at the site of some of the gravest abuses during the fall of El Fasher in October 2025. And broadly, we have concluded that the evidence that we collected in our report indicates that UAE authorities may be assisting or otherwise substantially contributing to the RSF's capacity to commit war crimes and crimes against humanity. And again, there has been piecemeal reporting on the UAE support to the RSF since the start of the war more than 3 years ago. And this report really adds to that growing body of indisputable evidence documenting the UAE's military support to this abusive armed group.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so I want to zoom in a bit on the UAE a little here, and maybe the recruitment process. So we know the mercenaries were first recruited by a Colombian-based company. They signed a contract with this company, and then they signed another contract with a UAE private security firm, as you mentioned. But importantly, they're sent to the UAE for training and are, according to the report, they're trained in the UAE by UAE nationals and in military bases. Mm-hmm. So can you talk to us just about this aspect? Is it the first time that such a direct role or involvement, that we see such a direct involvement of the UAE in military activities that are linked to the RSF in Sudan.
So these findings that these Colombian contractors transited through UAE military and government facilities before being deployed to Sudan, I would say are some of the most significant findings of this report, especially, of course, when it comes to the UAE. So this operation goes back as far as August 2024. That's when we started to see the first evidence of recruitment of Colombian contractors, as you said, by a Colombia-based recruitment company called A4SI. And in December of 2025, so just a few months ago, the U.S. Treasury Department actually sanctioned A4SI for its role in recruiting Colombian contractors before they were deployed to Sudan. So, we know that this company was involved in the on-the-ground recruitment of these Colombian contractors. Now, in the earlier phases of this operation, we found that the contractors, after having been recruited in Colombia, were sent to Abu Dhabi, and then from Abu Dhabi, they boarded private flights to Benghazi in Libya, where they then traveled overland to Sudan, to Darfur, where they were supporting the RSF's operations on the ground. And that key transit point through Abu Dhabi, as I said, is a key bit of evidence. The first public evidence of Colombian contractors in Sudan emerged in late 2024. And I think we can all remember these very infamous videos on social media where the joint forces had intercepted a convoy and found the identity documents of a number of Colombian contractors. Now, in one of those identity documents, a passport of a Colombian contractor, there was a UAE passport stamp, which sort of, was, again, the first indication of potential UAE involvement in this operation. Now, what we see is sort of the second phase of this deployment, began potentially around early 2025, where we started to see a new route through which the Colombian contractors were deployed. So again, they were recruited in Colombia, but this time we found that they were first sent to Bosaso, the semi-autonomous region of Somalia and Puntland, where they stayed in an underground bunker for a few days before they were then sent to the UAE. Now, in this instance, one of the Colombian contractors with whom I spoke said that when he arrived in Abu Dhabi, he did not go through the regular passport control. He did not have his passport stamped. Instead, he told me that he was sort of removed clandestinely, from the airport through the back, picked up immediately by a van and taken to a military site. That military site we documented as being a site called El Ghiathi base. And that's where he told me that he received military training by Emirati nationals before he was then, after 10 days, sent to Chad very briefly and then on to Sudan, to Niala. And I think what's significant about that particular military facility is that Human Rights Watch had documented its involvement, the Ghiathi base, in a very, very similar scheme going back to 2020. So in 2020, we released this report about how a ostensibly private company in the UAE called Black Shield Security Services recruited Sudanese security guards who were then sent to the same Ghiathi base where they received training and then were sent to the front lines in Libya to fight during the war in 2020 at that time. So it's quite significant that the same base is being used in a very, very similar scheme that we had documented, just 6 years ago. The significance of these transit points can't be understated. Finally, another key bit of evidence, because our report relies on some firsthand interviews that I conducted with Colombian contractors who themselves were deployed to Sudan, but we also did a deep dive open source investigation using dozens of photos, videos, that we were able to collect. And a key bit of evidence, thankfully for us, Colombian military contractors were not very hygienic with their social media presence. So we were able to get a lot of information on the routes that these individuals took before they were deployed to Sudan. And there's one key video which we emphasize in the report, where, it's a video that a Colombian contractor had posted to his TikTok, and he's taking a sort of selfie video of himself running outside in an area that really looked to our eyes initially as a UAE government site. Now, it took us a very, very long time to be able to geolocate this particular facility because the clip was 2 seconds. There was a UAE flag in the background, but it was a very challenging geolocation. That geolocation led us to another UAE government facility through which these military contractors transited. And that facility is called Al Wathba. It again is outside of Abu Dhabi. And yeah, it was another really key bit of evidence that we collected throughout the course of this reporting.
So I want to stop on the transit countries,
Yeah.
like third countries. You said there's Bosaso in like an independent region in Somalia, but there's also Chad, Libya. Are these countries aware that this is happening on their soil?
Of course, we wrote with the results of our findings to the Puntland authorities in Bosaso, also to Khalifa Haftar's authorities in eastern Libya, asking for comment. Unfortunately, we didn't receive a response to those letters. So it's really, it's difficult for us to speculate the extent of knowledge of those other governments of these operations. But certainly there's very strong political relationships between the UAE and the Eastern government in Libya, also as well in Bosaso. We know that the UAE has, a significant military presence in Bosaso as well. But yeah, it's difficult for us to be able to determine, the extent of knowledge of those respective governments in this report.
Let's talk about the mercenaries for a minute, because some of them were retired military officials from the Colombian army. Yeah. And I think in one instance, one of them was kind of misled and not told that he was taken to a conflict zone, but rather that he'd be a security guard for an oil infrastructure in the Middle East and Africa. So can you touch upon that a bit? Like, why do they do that? What's the idea behind going there? And
of the 2 Colombian contractors who themselves were deployed to Sudan that I interviewed, one, told me that he didn't realize he was going to be deployed to a war zone. And then the other did say that he was fully informed about, where he was going and that he would be, engaging in combat operations. In terms of this question of why Colombians, what's their motivation? Why do they keep sort of popping up? It's a very key question, and broadly we found that Colombia provides a very fertile recruitment ground for, private military contractors for a number of reasons. There is a sort of required retirement age for military personnel, so that leaves, a lot of young men in their late 30s, retired, but still, very much having the capacity to act in these roles. There are also, given the many years of conflict within Colombia, there's, many men who have many years of active conflict experience as well. And particularly to unpack the relationship between, Colombian military contractors and the UAE, we found that this goes as far back as 2011. In 2011, the New York Times came out with some reporting reporting that Mohammed bin Zayed had been building a sort of foreign legion of up to 800 Colombian private contractors to be part officially of the UAE Armed Forces. And one private retired contractor with whom we spoke said that he was part of that recruitment drive. And he told us that there was nothing clandestine about this operation, that they, it was very public. that he received, a proper work contract to be in the UAE. And so this was a sort of official foreign legion made up nearly entirely of Colombians. And so I think that's sort of where we see these relationships between UAE authorities and retired contractors begin to develop, and perhaps, why we're here today.
Let's talk a bit maybe about the Global Security Services Group. We know, the CEOs and the person who founded this group had quite close ties to the UAE authorities. So maybe you can elaborate a bit on this. Tell us who owns it, who are they, what's their role in all of this? They're kind of the in-between person.
Absolutely. Global Security Services Group is an Abu Dhabi-based security company, an ostensibly private security firm, where we have found that it was founded in 2016 by a man with the name of Ahmed Mohammed Al-Humairi, who at the time and still currently is the Secretary General of the UAE's Presidential Court. Ahmed Al-Humairi reports to Sheikh Mansour, who of course, is the UAE's Vice President, one of the, most important brothers of Mohammed bin Zayed himself, heads up Manchester City here in the UK. So this company, like I said, was founded in 2016 by this current UAE official. Now, a year later, we found that he transferred his shares of GSSG to Mohammed Hamdan Al-Zabi, its current CEO. Al-Zabi has remained the CEO, as to the best of our knowledge, since that time. But the two men maintain very strong business ties. So there's a number of companies where they have, shares to this day. We also documented that GSSG has been hired as a client by, very senior members of the UAE ruling family. According to a cache of leaked emails that we were able to obtain and review, Hazza al-Nahyan, who again is one of the brothers of Mohammed bin Zayed, hired 19 security guards from GSSG going as far back as 2019, according to these leaked emails. We also spoke to one former employee of GSSG who told me that he had provided security on a super yacht owned by Surur Mohammed, who is the maternal uncle of MBZ as well. So, we've documented a very close relationship between this company and, very senior members of the ruling family in Abu Dhabi. We also were able to obtain a number of licensing documents issued by UAE authorities to Global Security Services Group, including a rare armed security license in the UAE, amongst a number of other licensing documents. And even on GSSG's own website, up until very recently, the company boasted of having, this armed security license. The website also, again, up until very recently, carried the insignia of a number of important UAE ministries, saying that these ministries were its clients, and those ministries included the Ministry of Interior, the Ministry of Presidential Affairs, and the Ministry of International Cooperation. Now, if you go to their website now, that information has been scrubbed. You can make your own conclusion as to why. But, based off of a variety of different types of evidence, we found that there are these very strong, political, business, and familial relations between the company and UAE authorities. And just to unpack a little bit more about Mohammed Hamdan Al-Zabi, the company's CEO. So, as I said, he's been CEO as far as we can tell since 2017. And we also know that he has, strong relations with Hazza al-Nahyan as well. We found pictures showing that Hazza had attended his wedding as far back as 2014. And we also know that Zabi is married to the daughter of a very senior security official as well. So this kind of really, paints a picture of the very close relations between this company, its CEO, and UAE authorities.
Officially, it's a private company, right?
Yeah.
But also in the report, it mentioned an instance where the company also helped the Ugandan army in an operation. And when asked, the Ugandan army said that, they were acting on behalf of the UAE authorities. So is this private company an unofficial arm of the UAE government or the UAE authorities?
This is sort of the key question that, is at the heart of our report. And, as you said, there was this reporting from the Ugandan People's Defense Forces saying that they had received training by GSSG. And there was a picture of Mohammed Hamdan al-Zabi and one of the members of the Ugandan People's Defense Forces. And when asked by the Wall Street Journal about, this photo and this press release, the Ugandan People's Defense Forces, said that the GSSG presented itself as acting on behalf of the UAE government. Look, it was not possible for us to concretely determine that GSSG is acting as a proxy for UAE authorities. It's very, very difficult to get this kind of details and information inside of the UAE, given the level of repression, authoritarianism, surveillance. But given, the amount of evidence that we collected, it's clear that there are very strong linkages between the two, in addition to, us documenting how these Colombian contractors transited through bases and used very sensitive UAE government infrastructure. So all of that together paints a picture where we are able to say that, this operation provides further evidence that UAE authorities are, militarily supporting the RSF.
The actual mercenaries' role on the ground in the fighting. So there were reported instances of them actively participating in combat, in fighting. During the siege of Al-Fasher, during the takeover of Al-Fasher. But also there's a lot of witness reports, witness testimonies in your report about white fighters or foreign fighters standing by while RSF fighters were committing atrocities that have been well documented. So can you maybe elaborate a bit on that? And what I'm curious to know, maybe since you've spoken to some of them, did they have anything to say about the atrocities that they were witness to and that they've sort of allowed to happen right under their nose, right under their eyes?
Yeah, absolutely. So the Colombian contractors with whom I spoke had left Sudan before some of these most egregious abuses during the fall of Al-Fasher had taken place. And, we tried very hard to get in contact with any contractors directly who were there at that time, but it was very, very difficult. Outside of the abuses that happened in Al-Fasher, one of the contractors who I spoke with, as I said, did mention how he had supported the training of child soldiers by the RSF, which is absolutely devastating. In terms of the actual role, sort of military role that these contractors played, we documented through dozens of videos Colombian contractors fighting alongside the RSF, arm in arm, in frontline combat operations in Al-Fasher. And, some of the most devastating testimony came from when two of my colleagues traveled to document the fall of Al-Fasher and spoke to, a number of witnesses. And at least 6 witnesses found that they saw sort of white-looking fighters who didn't speak Arabic, who looked like foreigners, who were also wearing helmets and body armor and equipment that was significantly different than the usual gear and kit that RSF fighters are, kitted out with. And the descriptions that these victims of the fighters told us matched the social media videos that we had been collecting and verifying for months. So we could say, with somewhat confidence that these individuals that they were describing, these foreigners, were most likely, Colombians. And they told us that these Colombians merely stood by as RSF fighters carried out mass atrocities, killings of women, children, people with disabilities, some of the most atrocious crimes that Human Rights Watch has documented.
So we know of the terrible atrocities committed in the Sudan war that's been widely documented, widely reported on. We know of the UAE's role in it. And now, it's another piece to that puzzle. We know that there's Colombian mercenaries participating in it. And of course, we've seen this textbook play out in Yemen, where also Colombian mercenaries were hired by the UAE. to fight in Yemen. How far do you think the UAE is willing to go to further its interests in this or that conflict?
It's an incredibly disturbing pattern of foreign intervention that we have documented over the past decade, going as far back, as you said, to Yemen, the UAE being a part of the international coalition that carried out scores of indiscriminate, disproportionate airstrikes on civilians and civilian objects in Yemen, in addition to the fact that they supported abusive local forces, particularly in southern Yemen. We also can look to Libya as well, where Human Rights Watch again documented the UAE carrying out unlawful airstrikes and supporting abusive proxy forces. And now in Sudan, and arguably of all of these sort of proxy forces that the UAE has been linked to, the RSF is responsible for some of the worst, crimes against humanity, war crimes that we have come across. So with each stage of intervention that we've documented, it seems that the UAE keeps betting on, an even more abusive actor. And unfortunately, the international community has remained silent and remains silent to this day. And I think that has, allowed the UAE to act with even greater impunity in how it intervenes in these conflicts. We are 3 years into this war in Sudan, and the evidence of UAE military support to the RSF is mounting day by day. And allied governments of the UAE continue to rely on the weakest language possible. They are still saying that, quote unquote, external actors are fueling the war and are too cravenly and cowardly to call the UAE out by name. And that is appalling and needs to stop. And that's one of our main recommendations in this report, is that the UAE's allies, particularly the UK, the US, the EU member states, need to call a spade and call the UAE out by name. We're also calling on authorities to investigate with a view to imposing sanctions on Global Security Services Group and its CEO, Mohammed Hamdan al-Zabi. As I said, a number of the Colombia-based entities and companies have already been sanctioned by the U.S. Treasury Department. And, it's important to get to the heart of the operation, which is these individuals and entities that are very likely, hiring and sort of backing the operation. So it's important for those investigations to go forward. It's totally unacceptable at this point that the British government, that the US government, that the EU is still failing to call the UAE out by name. And I think that's why we are here and why the UAE has been able to get away with its, abusive actions abroad for so long. Human Rights Watch has called for an arms embargo on the UAE and the cutting off of weapons and other equipment sales for many years, given their, deleterious role in human rights in Yemen and Libya for so long. We still haven't seen that. And I think the UAE is such a clear case whereby economic, trade, and security relationships have, totally sidelined the role of human rights and the importance of human rights. Just last week, we saw the UK government sign a free trade agreement with the Gulf Cooperation Council, of which the UAE is a clear member. We had been asking for more transparency, whether there will be any human rights protections in that agreement from the UK government, received absolutely no response. And, we have this very happy announcement by the British government just a few days before we're releasing this report showcasing the UAE's role in Sudan and its support of the RSF. Remains to be seen whether the British government will come out with any strong statements condemning the UAE's role. We really hope they will do that, but unfortunately they've been extremely hesitant to take any serious action on these abuses so far.
Thank you so much for coming today and for speaking with us. Really appreciate it.
Thanks so much for having me.